A family bought their dream home for $600,000, and 18 months later, they were standing in their backyard watching a crack in the foundation grow wide enough to slide a coin into. Nobody warned them. Nobody saw it coming. And the worst part is that the mistake that caused it happened years before they ever moved in, poured into the concrete by a crew that was in too much of a hurry to do it right. If you have ever wondered what really happens beneath the surface of a house, behind the drywall, under the slab, hidden in places most people never think to look, then you are exactly who this channel is for. Subscribe now, because every investigation we run digs into real construction failures, the ones that quietly drain thousands of dollars from unsuspecting homeowners, and we show you exactly how to spot the warning signs before they become disasters of your own. Concrete looks simple, gray, solid, permanent. It is the material poured into nearly every foundation, driveway, sidewalk, and patio in America. And most people assume that once it hardens, the job is done and the house is safe. But concrete is far more delicate than it looks. It is a living chemical process, one that depends on precise timing, precise moisture, and precise technique. And when even one of those details goes wrong, the damage can stay invisible for years before it finally breaks through the surface. That family's crack did not start the day they noticed it. It started the day the concrete crew mixed too much water into their batch to make it easier to pour. Watery concrete flows beautifully. It slides into forms without much effort, which makes the job faster and the crew happier. But what nobody tells the homeowner is that extra water is quietly stealing strength from every inch of that slab. As the water evaporates, it leaves behind tiny air pockets throughout the concrete, and those pockets become the starting points for cracks that spread slowly, silently, for years. At first, it doesn't seem like a serious problem. The homeowner sees a hairline crack on the garage floor and assumes it is just cosmetic. Most homeowners never notice this until the crack widens enough to catch a shoe or trip a toddler. By then, the water is already getting in. Picture rainwater seeping down through that widening crack, drop by drop, into the soil beneath the foundation. Over months, that soil begins to shift. Where it was once compact and stable, it becomes soft and uneven, and the concrete resting on top of it starts to settle unevenly too. This is when small cosmetic cracks turn into structural ones, the kind that run diagonally across a wall or pop tiles loose in a kitchen. What began as a shortcut taken to save an hour on a job site becomes a foundation problem that can cost tens of thousands of dollars to repair. Professional concrete crews know this, which is why the good ones test the mix before it ever touches the ground. They use a simple cone-shaped tool to measure how much the concrete slumps under its own weight, checking that it has just enough water to be workable, but not so much that it becomes weak. It takes an extra 15 minutes. It is one of the cheapest insurance policies in construction, and it is exactly the kind of step corner-cutting crews skip when they are racing to finish 3 jobs in one day. But here's where everything changes, because watery concrete is only the first mistake on this list, and it is far from the most expensive one. The second mistake hides somewhere almost nobody thinks to look, and that is exactly why it is so dangerous. It lives underground, beneath the footprint of the house itself, in the soil that every foundation depends on. Before a single truck of concrete ever arrives at a job site, the ground beneath it is supposed to be compacted, meaning compressed and stabilized so it can bear the enormous weight of a home without shifting. Builders use heavy vibrating plates or rollers to press the soil down into a dense, uniform base. When that step gets skipped or rushed, the soil underneath a home stays loose, full of tiny air gaps between particles of dirt. To the eye, freshly graded soil looks the same, whether it has been properly compacted or not. That is the trap. A homeowner walking the lot before construction would never know the difference, and neither would most inspectors doing a quick visual pass. This hidden detail changes everything, because loose soil behaves unpredictably once weight is placed on top of it. As the seasons pass and rain soaks into the ground, that loose soil compresses on its own, unevenly, in whatever pattern gravity and water happen to create. One corner of the house might sink slightly, while another stays put. That uneven settling is what causes doors that no longer close properly, windows that stick, and diagonal cracks that creep across drywall like spider webs. Now picture the difference between two houses built side by side. One where the crew took the time to properly compact and test the soil, and one where they didn't. 5 years later, the first house still has its original smooth walls and doors that swing freely. The second house has a homeowner calling a foundation repair company, staring at an estimate that starts at $15,000 and climbs from there, depending on how many hydraulic piers need to be driven deep into the ground to stabilize what should have been solid from the very beginning. What happened next surprised even experienced inspectors who reviewed the case. When they finally excavated near the foundation to figure out why one side of the home had dropped nearly 2 inches, they discovered the soil compaction test that was supposed to be filed with the county had never actually been performed. The paperwork existed, the test did not. It was signed off using numbers copied from a previous job, an old trick some cheap contractors use to speed through inspections without doing the actual work. That is the disturbing pattern behind so many of these expensive mistakes. They are not always about ignorance. Sometimes they are about the pressure to move fast, cut costs, and get to the next job, with the assumption that problems this deep will not surface until long after the crew has been paid and moved on. Most homeowners never notice this next mistake either, and it involves something every single house depends on, every single day: water drainage around the foundation. It sounds almost too simple to matter, but grading, the gentle slope of the ground around a house, is one of the most overlooked and most expensive mistakes in residential construction. Here's the idea in its simplest form. The ground around a house is supposed to slope gently away from the foundation in every direction, guiding rainwater away from the building rather than toward it. When builders get lazy with grading, or when landscaping companies later disturb that slope while planting gardens or laying new sod, water starts pooling right up against the foundation walls instead of running off. At first it looks harmless, maybe a little puddle after a heavy storm that disappears by the next afternoon. But the biggest mistake hadn't even happened yet. Water sitting against a foundation, day after day, storm after storm, slowly works its way through even the smallest imperfections in the concrete. It seeps through hairline cracks, through gaps around basement windows, through the joint where the foundation wall meets the footing below it. Inside the house, the consequences show up far from where the actual problem started. A musty smell creeps into the basement. A patch of drywall near the floor starts to feel soft when pressed. Paint begins to bubble along the baseboards. Homeowners often blame these signs on humidity or an old air conditioning unit, never suspecting that the real source is standing water pooling against their foundation, 20 feet away and completely out of sight. This is where mold enters the picture, and it deserves special attention because it represents one of the most costly and health-relevant consequences on this entire list. Mold thrives in dark, damp, poorly ventilated spaces, exactly the environment created when water infiltrates a basement or crawl space and never fully dries out. Once mold colonies establish themselves inside wall cavities or under flooring, remediation is not a simple wipe-down job. Contractors often need to remove and replace entire sections of drywall, insulation, and sometimes subflooring, all while containing the area so spores don't spread throughout the rest of the home. Compare that outcome to a house where the grading was done correctly from day one. Rain falls, follows the gentle slope away from the foundation, and drains harmlessly into the yard or a drainage system designed for exactly that purpose. The basement stays dry. The air stays fresh. The homeowner never even thinks about foundation drainage because it is quietly doing its job, year after year, without demanding a single dollar of emergency repair. Professional builders reinforce this natural slope with additional layers of protection. Things like foundation waterproofing membranes applied directly to the exterior concrete walls before backfilling, and perforated drainage pipes buried alongside the footing to carry water away before it ever has a chance to pressure the foundation. These systems cost a modest amount during construction. Retrofitting them after the fact, once a home is already built and landscaped, can multiply that cost several times over because it often requires excavating around the entire perimeter of the house. There was one critical mistake almost nobody noticed until the fourth mistake on this list connected the dots for investigators reviewing failed foundations across multiple neighborhoods. And it involves the reinforcing steel hidden deep inside poured concrete walls and slabs. Concrete is remarkably strong under compression, meaning it resists being crushed extremely well. But it is surprisingly weak under tension, meaning it resists being pulled apart or bent far less effectively. That is why builders embed steel reinforcing bars, commonly called rebar, throughout concrete structures. The steel handles the tension forces that concrete alone cannot, and together the two materials create something far stronger than either one on its own. The mistake happens when that rebar is placed incorrectly, too close to the surface, too far apart, or in the wrong position within the slab entirely. Sometimes crews in a hurry simply lay the rebar directly on the ground before pouring, instead of suspending it at the correct height using small plastic supports called chairs. When that happens, the concrete gets poured around rebar sitting at the very bottom of the slab instead of properly centered within it, which means the steel cannot do its job the way engineers intended. This hidden detail changes everything about how that slab performs under stress. A foundation with correctly placed rebar can flex slightly and redistribute forces when soil shifts beneath it, resisting cracks and holding its shape. A foundation with poorly placed rebar behaves almost like plain, unreinforced concrete, brittle and prone to cracking under exactly the kind of soil movement that happens naturally over years of seasonal freezing, thawing, and settling. What makes this mistake especially dangerous is that it is completely invisible once the concrete has cured. There is no way for a homeowner, or even most inspectors doing a routine walkthrough, to look at a finished slab and know whether the steel inside is positioned correctly. The only way to catch this mistake is during construction itself, before the pour happens, when a qualified inspector can physically verify rebar placement, spacing, and height using a simple tape measure. This is exactly why serious home buyers, and especially those building custom homes from scratch, hire independent third-party inspectors to check these details at every stage of construction, rather than trusting the builder's own internal inspection process. It might feel like an unnecessary expense at the time, a few $100s here and there throughout the building process, but it is nothing compared to the cost of discovering a structural rebar problem after the walls are already up and the family has already moved in. Now comes the part that costs homeowners the most money out of every mistake on this entire list, and it involves something that seems almost too obvious to cause serious damage: poor concrete curing. Curing is the process by which concrete gains its strength over time. This surprises a lot of people because concrete feels rock solid within a day of being poured, hard enough to walk on, hard enough to look completely finished. But that early hardness is deceptive. Concrete continues developing strength for weeks after it is poured, and the way it is treated during that critical early period determines whether it reaches its full potential strength or falls dramatically short of it. The chemical reaction that hardens concrete needs water to continue, and it needs that water to stay present inside the slab for an extended period, not just during the pour itself. When concrete dries out too quickly, especially in hot or windy conditions, the surface can harden while the moisture needed for deeper curing simply evaporates away before the chemical process finishes. The result is concrete that looks completely normal, but is significantly weaker than it should be, sometimes losing a substantial percentage of its intended strength. Cheap or rushed crews often skip proper curing altogether. They pour the concrete, smooth the surface, and move directly on to the next task without covering the slab, without applying a curing compound, and without keeping it damp during those critical first days. It saves time on the job site, and because the damage is invisible, nobody catches it until years later, when that understrength concrete starts cracking under loads it should have easily handled. Professional crews treat curing with the seriousness it deserves. Some cover fresh concrete with plastic sheeting to trap moisture inside. Others spray on a curing compound, a liquid that forms a protective film across the surface, sealing moisture in so the chemical reaction can finish properly. In hot climates, crews sometimes even mist the surface periodically with water for several days after the pour. It looks unremarkable to anyone walking by, just a slab covered in plastic or slightly damp to the touch. But that unremarkable process is quietly determining whether that concrete will still be solid in 20 years or cracking apart in 5. This hidden detail changes everything when you consider how many homes across hot, dry regions of the country experience premature concrete failure. Driveways that crumble at the edges within a few years, garage floors that develop networks of cracks despite never bearing unusual weight, patios that flake and spall, losing their surface layer in chunks. In almost every one of these cases, the root cause traces back to concrete that never finished curing properly, robbed of the time and moisture it needed by a crew focused on finishing the job quickly rather than finishing it right. But the story does not end with the concrete itself, because even a perfectly poured, perfectly cured, perfectly reinforced foundation can still fail if the water management systems around it are neglected. And that brings us to one of the most underestimated mistakes homeowners make after they move in: ignoring their gutters and downspouts. It seems almost too simple to belong on a list about expensive construction failures, but gutters and downspouts are doing far more work than most people realize. Their entire purpose is to catch rainwater running off a roof and carry it well away from the foundation before it has a chance to pool against the house. When gutters clog with leaves and debris, or when downspouts empty directly next to the foundation instead of extending several feet away, all that carefully engineered drainage and grading work gets undone in an instant, right where it matters most. Picture a heavy rainstorm rolling through. On a house with clean gutters and properly extended downspouts, water gets captured, channeled, and released far from the foundation, exactly as designed. On a house with clogged gutters, water overflows straight down the side of the building, pooling directly against the foundation wall, in the very spot the grading was supposed to protect. Do this every storm, every season, for a few years, and even a well-built foundation starts absorbing moisture it was never designed to handle. This is a mistake that costs homeowners thousands, not because of what a builder did wrong, but because of simple maintenance that gets forgotten once the excitement of moving into a new home fades into daily life. Cleaning gutters twice a year and checking that downspouts extend at least several feet from the foundation takes an afternoon and costs almost nothing. Ignoring it for years can lead to the exact same basement moisture, mold growth, and foundation cracking problems caused by bad grading in the first place. Except this time the homeowner has nobody to blame but a chore they kept putting off. At this point in the investigation, a pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Nearly every expensive mistake traces back to water, whether it is water mixed into concrete too generously, water pooling against a foundation because of poor grading, water trapped inside curing concrete that evaporated too soon, or water overflowing from neglected gutters. Water is patient, and water is relentless, and it exploits every shortcut, every skipped step, every corner cut during construction, slowly and silently, until the damage finally becomes impossible to ignore. There is one more mistake that ties directly into everything discussed so far, and it involves the footings, the wide concrete bases poured beneath foundation walls to spread the weight of the entire house across a larger area of soil. Footings are supposed to sit below the frost line, the depth in the ground where soil no longer freezes during winter. This detail changes dramatically depending on where in the country a home is being built, ranging from just a few inches in warm southern states to several feet deep in colder northern regions. When footings are poured too shallow, above the frost line in a cold climate, something called frost heave becomes a serious risk. As winter sets in, moisture in the soil beneath the footing freezes and expands, physically pushing upward against the footing with tremendous force. Come spring, that same soil thaws and contracts again, and the footing settles back down, though rarely to exactly the same position it started in. Repeat this freeze and thaw cycle year after year, and foundations begin to shift unpredictably, cracking walls and misaligning doors and windows in ways that seem to appear out of nowhere. Builders working in regions with serious winters know their local frost depth requirements well, and reputable contractors dig footings well below that line without exception. It is a non-negotiable detail written directly into local building codes for exactly this reason. Yet mistakes still happen, particularly on additions or smaller structures like porches and detached garages, where crews sometimes assume the frost depth requirements that apply to a full house somehow do not apply to a smaller structure. They do. Frost pushes on a small footing exactly as forcefully as it pushes on a large one, and homeowners with sinking porches or cracked garage slabs often trace the problem back to exactly this oversight. By now, it should be clear that nearly every disaster on this list shares a common thread, and it is not bad luck. It is not unavoidable circumstance. It is decisions made quietly, often invisibly, by crews working under pressure to finish faster and spend less. Decisions that homeowners have no way of seeing until years later, when cracks appear, floors sag, or basements start to smell of mildew. The good news buried inside all of this is that every single mistake on this list is entirely preventable. Properly tested concrete mixes, properly compacted soil, correctly angled grading, precisely placed rebar, patiently cured slabs, well-maintained gutters, and footings poured to the correct depth. None of these require exotic materials or advanced technology. They require nothing more than following procedures that have been well understood in the construction industry for decades. The difference between a home that stands strong for a century and one that starts cracking within a few years often comes down to nothing more than whether someone took the extra 15 minutes to do a job correctly instead of rushing to the next one. For anyone buying an existing home, the lesson translates into practical action. Hiring an independent home inspector who specifically checks for foundation cracks, drainage patterns, basement moisture, and grading issues can reveal warning signs long before they become expensive emergencies. For anyone building a new home, insisting on third-party inspections at critical stages before the concrete pour during rebar placement and throughout the curing period provides a layer of protection that a builder's own internal checklist simply cannot replace. What started as a single crack in one family's backyard turned out to be a window into a much larger story, one playing out quietly in neighborhoods across the entire country, where invisible shortcuts taken years earlier eventually surface as very visible, very expensive problems. The house itself never lies. Every crack, every stain, every sticking door is simply concrete and wood and drywall, trying to tell a story about what really happened beneath the surface, long before anyone moved in. If this investigation opened your eyes to what's really hiding behind the walls of an ordinary home, come back next week, because there is always another mystery waiting beneath the surface, another expensive mistake hiding in plain sight, and another story worth uncovering before it costs you thousands.